On December 21st, 1970, the king of rock and roll walked into the White House unannounced, carrying a Colt .45 pistol as a gift, wearing a purple velvet cape, and handed the President of the United States a 6-page handwritten letter asking to become a federal narcotics agent. By the time Elvis Presley walked out of the Oval Office that day, he had a badge, a handshake with Richard Nixon, and the sincere belief that he was now authorized to fight the drug war undercover. This is the true story of the most bizarre meeting in White House history. The day the biggest star in the world convinced the most powerful man in the world that he could infiltrate the hippies. It started on a plane, December 19th, 1970. Elvis Presley was sitting in first class on a flight from Memphis to Washington, D.C., scribbling furiously on American Airlines stationery. He was angry. He was hurt. He'd just had a fight with his father, Vernon, and his wife, Priscilla, about money, about control, about respect. So Elvis did what Elvis always did when he felt trapped. He ran. He grabbed a pile of cash, called a couple of buddies, and bought tickets to Washington on a whim. But this wasn't just a tantrum. Elvis had a plan. A wild, grandiose, completely sincere plan. He was going to meet the president. He was going to offer his services to the government. And he was going to get himself a federal badge, the one thing his money and fame couldn't buy. The one symbol of authority and legitimacy that had always been out of reach for a poor kid from Tupelo, Mississippi, who'd made it big singing rock and roll. So on that plane, Elvis Presley began writing a letter to President Richard Nixon. 6 pages, handwritten, rambling, passionate, and absolutely real. He wrote about the drug epidemic destroying America's youth. He wrote about the counterculture, the anti-war protesters, the Beatles, and their dangerous influence. He wrote about how he, Elvis Presley, could help, because he understood young people. He was still trusted by them. And he had an idea. He could go undercover. He could infiltrate the drug culture. He could be a federal agent working from the inside. He wrote, "I have done an in-depth study of drug abuse and communist brainwashing techniques, and I am right in the middle of the whole thing, where I can and will do the most good." He wasn't joking. He believed every word. Elvis Presley, the man who'd been taking prescription pills for years, who had a medicine cabinet that looked like a pharmacy, genuinely saw himself as the solution to America's drug problem. The irony was lost on him. The sincerity was not. When the plane landed, Elvis didn't check into a hotel and call for an appointment. That wasn't his style. He went straight to the White House gates at 6:30 in the morning, walked up to the guard, and handed him the letter in a sealed envelope. He told the guard to deliver it personally to President Nixon. Then he wrote down the phone number of his hotel and said he'd be waiting for a call. Then Elvis left, and he went shopping. Because even on a mission to become a federal agent, Elvis Presley needed the right outfit. By mid-morning, Elvis was back at his hotel, the Washington Hotel, wearing a purple velvet suit, a cape, a massive gold belt buckle, amber sunglasses, and enough jewelry to stock a pawn shop. He looked like a Vegas showman doing cosplay as a drug enforcement officer. But Elvis thought he looked official. He thought he looked serious. He'd also stopped by the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs office earlier that morning, unannounced, trying to get a tour and maybe a badge. They politely turned him away. He wasn't discouraged. He was just getting started. Back at the White House, President Nixon's staff were reading the letter, and they were stunned. Dwight Chapin, one of Nixon's deputies, read it and immediately saw the opportunity. Nixon was deeply unpopular with young people. The Vietnam War had turned an entire generation against him, and here was Elvis Presley, still beloved, still trusted by middle America, offering to publicly align himself with the president. It was a PR goldmine. By noon, Chapin had called Elvis's hotel. "Mr. Presley, the president will see you. Can you be here at 12:30? Elvis didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." He grabbed his buddies Jerry Schilling and Sonny West and they headed to the White House. Elvis also grabbed something else, a World War II-era Colt .45 pistol in a display case. It was a gift for the president. Because in Elvis's mind, that's what you bring when you meet the most powerful man in the world. When they arrived at the White House gate, the Secret Service stopped them immediately. They saw the gun case. Elvis explained it was a gift. They confiscated it anyway. Elvis was annoyed, but he let it go. He had bigger things to focus on. He was about to meet Richard Nixon, and he was going to walk out of that meeting with a badge. At 12:30 p.m., Elvis Presley was escorted into the Oval Office. The most famous entertainer in the world was about to meet the President of the United States. But here's the thing. Neither man really knew what to say to the other. Nixon was stiff, formal, uncomfortable around celebrities. Elvis was nervous, rambling, trying too hard to impress. It should have been awkward. And at first, it was. Elvis walked in and immediately started talking. He talked about the drug problem. He talked about how the Beatles had been a real force for anti-American sentiment. He talked about the need for law and order. He told Nixon that young people didn't respect authority anymore, but they still respected him. Elvis. He could reach them. He could help. Nixon listened. He wasn't a fan of rock and roll. He didn't understand Elvis's appeal. But he understood politics. And he understood that this man, sitting across from him, in a purple cape and sunglasses, represented a connection to a demographic Nixon desperately needed. So Nixon played along. Elvis kept talking. He told Nixon about his concerns with the counterculture, about how drugs were destroying the country, about how he wanted to help the government fight back. And then he got to the point. He wanted to be made a federal agent at large for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. He wanted a badge, a real badge, the kind that came with authority, with respect, with legitimacy. Nixon looked at his aides. They nodded. Why not? It wasn't a real commission. It wasn't actual law enforcement authority. It was honorary, a gesture, a photo op. But to Elvis, it would mean everything. And to Nixon, it was a cheap way to win goodwill with one of the most famous men in America. Nixon agreed. He told Elvis he'd arrange for the badge to be presented. Elvis's face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. He stood up. And then, in a moment that shocked everyone in the room, Elvis Presley walked over to President Richard Nixon and hugged him. Not a handshake. A hug. A full, sincere, emotional embrace. Nixon, awkward, stiff, uncomfortable Richard Nixon, stood there frozen, arms at his sides, while the king of rock and roll squeezed him like a long-lost friend. The aides in the room didn't know whether to laugh or call security. But Elvis didn't care. He was overwhelmed with gratitude. He'd come to Washington on a whim, written a letter on a plane, walked up to the White House gate, and now the President of the United States was giving him a federal badge. In Elvis's mind, this was destiny. This was validation. This was proof that he mattered beyond the music, beyond the movies, beyond the fame. Before Elvis left the Oval Office, they took photos. Elvis and Nixon shaking hands. Elvis showing off his badge. The pictures are stiff, awkward, surreal. Two men from completely different worlds, standing together in the most powerful office on earth, both of them convinced they were using the other for their own purposes. When Elvis walked out of the White House that day, he was holding a Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs badge. It was gold. It had his name on it. And as far as Elvis was concerned, it was the real thing. He believed he was now a federal agent. He believed he had authority. He believed he could walk into airports, flash that badge, and carry whatever he wanted. And for a while, he tried. Stories started circulating. Elvis flashing his badge to skip security lines. Elvis showing it to cops when he got pulled over. Elvis telling people he was working undercover for the government. None of it was true. The badge was honorary. It had no legal authority. But Elvis didn't care about the technicalities. He had the badge. That was all that mattered. But here's the tragic irony of the whole story. Elvis Presley walked into the White House and convinced Richard Nixon that he could fight the war on drugs. He talked about the dangers of narcotics, about the destruction of American youth, about the need for law and order. And the entire time, Elvis himself was drowning in prescription drugs, painkillers, sedatives, stimulants, sleeping pills. Elvis had been taking pills for years, not street drugs, but legal prescriptions from doctors who gave him whatever he wanted. He didn't see the contradiction. In Elvis's mind, prescription drugs weren't the problem. They were medicine. They were legal. They were controlled. The problem was the hippies smoking marijuana, dropping acid, rejecting authority. That was the enemy. That was what needed to be stopped. Elvis genuinely believed he was on the right side of the fight. He genuinely believed he could help. But the people around him knew the truth. Jerry Schilling, who was with Elvis that day at the White House, later said the whole thing was heartbreaking. Because Elvis was sincere. He wasn't joking. He wasn't being ironic. He truly wanted to do something good. He truly wanted to serve his country. But he was blind to his own demons. Blind to the fact that the very thing he wanted to fight was the thing that was slowly killing him. By 1977, just 7 years after that meeting with Nixon, Elvis Presley was dead. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia. The real cause was an overdose of prescription drugs. The same drugs he'd been taking for years. The same drugs he didn't consider a problem because they came from a doctor, not a street dealer. The badge he got from Nixon. He treasured it until the day he died. He kept it with him, showed it off, bragged about it. It represented something Elvis had always wanted: respect from authority, legitimacy, the sense that he was more than just an entertainer, that he mattered in a way that went beyond the stage. But the badge couldn't save him. It couldn't stop the pills. It couldn't fix the loneliness, the paranoia, the pressure of being Elvis Presley every single day of his life. It was just a piece of metal, a symbol, a memento of the day the king of rock and roll walked into the White House and convinced the President of the United States that he could be a secret agent. Looking back, the meeting between Elvis and Nixon is one of the strangest moments in American history. It's funny. It's absurd. It's the kind of thing that sounds like a joke, but is completely, verifiably true. The letter exists. The photos exist. The badge exists. The official memos from the White House staff exist. This isn't legend. This isn't rumor. This actually happened. But it's also tragic, because it shows a man at the height of his fame, desperate for meaning, desperate for purpose, desperate to be taken seriously by the establishment that had always looked down on rock and roll. And it shows a president so disconnected from reality that he thought giving Elvis Presley a narcotics badge was good politics. Neither man got what they really wanted from that meeting. Nixon didn't win over the youth vote. His presidency ended in disgrace 3 years later with Watergate. Elvis didn't become a secret agent. He didn't infiltrate the drug culture. He didn't save America's youth. He just got a badge, and 7 years later, he was gone. But for one afternoon in December 1970, in the Oval Office of the White House, two of the most famous men in the world stood together and shook hands. One of them was the president. The other was the king. And for a brief, surreal moment, they both believed they could change the world. The photo of that handshake is now one of the most requested images in the National Archives. People see it and laugh. They see it and shake their heads. They see Elvis in his cape and Nixon in his suit, and they think, how did this even happen? But if you look closer, if you really look at Elvis's face in that photo, you see something else. You see hope. You see pride. You see a man who, just for a moment, felt like he mattered for something more than his voice. And that's the real story. Not the absurdity, not the irony, but the desperation underneath it all. Elvis Presley didn't walk into the White House as a joke. He walked in as a man trying to prove something. To the president, to the country, to himself. He walked in believing he could make a difference. He walked in looking for respect. And he walked out with a badge that meant nothing. But to Elvis, it meant everything. And maybe that's the saddest part of all. In the years after that meeting, Elvis carried that badge everywhere. He'd pull it out at parties, show it to strangers, flash it at airport security. He told people he was working on special assignments for the government. He'd call up police departments in different cities, identify himself as a federal agent, and ask to ride along on drug busts. Sometimes they'd humor him. Sometimes they'd politely decline. But Elvis never stopped believing it was real. His friends watched him spiral. They watched the pills multiply. They watched his weight balloon and drop and balloon again. They watched him become paranoid, convinced people were out to get him, convinced he needed protection, convinced that the badge somehow made him safer. It didn't. It was just a piece of metal that fed his delusions. Priscilla Presley later said that the Nixon meeting was a turning point, not because it changed Elvis, but because it revealed what he'd become. A man so disconnected from reality that he could stand in the Oval Office, high on prescription pills, and lecture the president about the dangers of drug abuse without seeing the contradiction. A man so desperate for validation that he'd fly across the country on a whim just to get a badge that had no legal meaning. The people who worked in the Nixon White House later admitted they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the badge was meaningless. They knew Elvis wasn't going to infiltrate anything. But they also knew the photo opportunity was priceless. And they were right. That image of Elvis and Nixon shaking hands became iconic. Not because it represented anything real, but because it perfectly captured the absurdity of that moment in American history. 1970. A country tearing itself apart, and the two men at the center of it all, each using the other for their own purposes. But here's what makes the story truly haunting. Elvis's daughter, Lisa Marie, was only 2 years old when her father walked into the White House. She'd grow up watching him deteriorate. She'd grow up seeing that badge on his dresser, hearing him talk about his work for the government, watching him take pill after pill after pill. And she'd grow up knowing that the day her father got that badge was the day he stopped seeing himself clearly. Years later, when they opened Graceland to the public, that badge was put on display. Tourists walk past it every day. They take pictures of it. They laugh about it. They post it on social media with captions like, "The day Elvis became a narc." But they don't understand what it really represents. It's not a punchline. It's not a quirky piece of celebrity trivia. It's evidence. Evidence of a man who had everything: fame, wealth, talent, adoration, and still felt like he had nothing. Evidence of a man who thought a badge from the government could fill the void inside him. The meeting between Elvis and Nixon lasted less than an hour, but the consequences lasted a lifetime. It emboldened Elvis's worst instincts. It validated his belief that the pills weren't a problem. It gave him a sense of authority that was completely false, and it allowed everyone around him, his management, his entourage, his doctors, to keep enabling him, because if the President of the United States gave him a badge, how bad could things really be? In the end, Elvis Presley died alone in his bathroom at Graceland on August 16th, 1977. The coroner found 14 different drugs in his system. The badge Nixon gave him was in his bedroom. It didn't protect him. It didn't save him. It didn't give him purpose or meaning or legitimacy. It was just a reminder of the day a desperate man in a purple cape convinced the most powerful man in the world to take him seriously. And the cruelest part? Nixon probably forgot about the meeting the moment Elvis walked out of the Oval Office. It was a photo op, a political stunt, 5 minutes of his day. But for Elvis, it was everything. It was proof he mattered, proof he could serve his country, proof he was more than just a singer. December 21st, 1970. the day Elvis Presley walked into the White House and asked Richard Nixon for a narcotics badge. He got what he wanted, and it destroyed him. Because sometimes the things we think will save us are the very things that kill us. And sometimes a badge that means nothing can mean everything, if you're desperate enough to believe it.